What's crackin', elasmites? Welcome back to the show that toasts your bread and puts jelly on top. Strawberry jelly, of course. None of that grape crap. I, your host, Sam McNeely, will be chefing up today's episode, which is part 2 of my chat with Dr. Greg Skomal. And I know you're probably like, wait, don't spoil the guest until after the intro. Well, first of all, their name is in the title of the episode, and you clicked on it. Secondly, I introduced them last week, and this is part 2. So unless you like watching or listening to things in reverse order, you already know this week's guest. But anyways, thanks for listening today, and don't forget to check out our other episodes. Another huge thanks to all you Patreon donors who keep this show swimming in the deep blue that is the interweb by giving at patreon.com/elasmuspod. If you're thinking about supporting this podcast, please check out that Patreon page to see what additional benefits you can receive by becoming an Elasmite donor. So that's patreon.com/elasmuspod. Thanks to those who also rate and review this podcast. And remember, if you rate and review this podcast on whatever platform you're listening to it on and send that rating and review to me at elasmuspod@gmail.com, you'll be entered into a raffle to win a prize. Who doesn't love that? And if you share this podcast on social media, you'll get 2 extra entries into that drawing. Remember to tag us so that we know you shared. So that's rate, review, share on social media, and email me at elasmospod@gmail.com. You can find the Elasmos Podcast on Instagram and Twitter at elasmospod, and our Facebook page and YouTube channel are both called the Elasmos Podcast, A Shark's Universe. Our website is elasmospod.com, where you can find links to all of these media outlets. And lastly, don't forget to send your listeners' adventure stories to me at elasmospod@gmail.com for our listeners' episodes. And this will encourage people to branch out into the great wide open. Don't worry, there's plenty more singing. Just kidding, I promise. Alright, now the reintroduction. And no, silly, I'm not talking about the conservation technique to bring back animals to places they used to live at some point in the past. I'm talking about, again, introducing our phenomenal guest, Dr. Greg Skomal. I'll use what we talked about in part 1 as this week's intro. He's from Connecticut. This man is a big fish guy, just like yours truly. He was a non-traditional student when it comes to typical grad school paths. I also think he's probably worked with about every shark there is. That's at least what I've gathered from this. But he's a great white shark specialist. That's right, he's kind of the coolest. His charisma is on great white shark levels, and he's so much fun to talk to that I had to make this second part where we talked about the mysteries of great sex. Oh, wait, that's not right. That's great white shark sex. Okay, yeah, that makes more sense. We also talked about temperature regulation of deep divers, shark acrobatics, what it's like chasing white sharks, and much, much more, including our beloved Shark Week. Here's the man himself, great white shark expert, Dr. Greg Skomal. This is episode 10, part 2. Okay, so Elasmite listener, where were we? What? You don't know? Well, I guess we don't have an episode today. Thanks for coming. I guess we'll try again next week. Ah, come on. I'm just yanking your teeth out. Of course we have an episode for today. I did a whole intro. So Greg and I were talking about the rebounding white shark population in the Atlantic. And we'll just do a bit of a recap here, where I asked Greg, were there this many sharks and they just moved up towards where the food was? Or did the increase in food increase their carrying capacity, or the maximum individuals? And that's why we've begun to see a lot more great whites near New England. So, which is it? Okay, fine. I'll stop asking you the questions and I'll just send them to Greg. Here he is.
Right. No, it's a great question, and I get it a lot. First of all, we know from historical data that dating back to, the year 1800, that white sharks have been historically distributed all the way from the Gulf of Mexico to Canada. So we're not seeing any change in its basic distribution. All right. What we have been able to tease out of long-term data sets, and this is a paper we published a bunch of years ago, is that it appears that the white shark population on the eastern seaboard of the U.S. was hit pretty hard by the expansion of recreational and commercial fisheries targeting shark species as well as tunas and swordfish. All right. And that primarily occurred in the 70s, 80s, and early 90s. And so white shark was primarily taken not only as targeted by recreational fishermen, and some attribute that to the expansion of recreational fishing of sharks brought about by Jaws, but also a massive expansion in commercial fishing for tunas and swordfish, which put literally hundreds of thousands of hooks in the water targeting those species. And white sharks, like many sharks, were taken as bycatch. And we think that hit the population pretty hard and drove it down pretty hard. In 1997, the U.S. government, followed by many states in the early 2000s, prohibited the retention of white sharks. So now we've got, what amounts to 20 years plus of protection of white sharks that allowed that population to go from low levels and start ramping back up. Their reproductive rate, as you suggested, is very low, although we haven't really sorted that out. We think females give birth once every 2 to 3 years to maybe a dozen or so young. And so that's a very low reproductive rate. So like seals, it takes a long time for them to come back. And now we believe they are coming back. They're rebounding to historical levels, and not only rebounding, but now coming close to shore in response to the presence of seals. So we're seeing more white sharks too along our coastline and along the New England coastline.
Oh man, that's exciting. Especially for you, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And something that I've known is like a big mystery, especially with great white sharks, is breeding grounds and like where and when they breed. Are we getting any closer to finding the missing piece to that puzzle?
The problem with that is, we've been studying white sharks not only here in New England in a relatively short period of time, but when we look at white shark populations where they've been studying them, since the late 60s, they still haven't quite figured out where white sharks mate and where they give birth. They've
crazy.
got all kinds of ideas, and they've been tagging sharks for a long time. We think they might give birth in nearshore areas, because we find lots of white sharks in shallow coastal areas. And that may be the case here in off the northeastern U.S. We don't have a sense of where they're mating yet. Even though you get males and females that are adults overlapping in certain areas. Like Cape Cod, for example, we have adult males and adult females overlapping. So that would be a good place to reproduce, even though we don't have a lot of direct evidence of mating activity. So there's a lot of big questions that we have here in New England, off the eastern seaboard of the U.S., in the Atlantic, but they also have those questions in the Pacific and Indian Oceans as well, still, because it's really hard to answer those questions.
Oh my God, I can only imagine, yeah. Especially because they have such a wide geographic range.
Exactly.
Not just that they're found all over the world, but even within populations. I mean, up and down the East Coast, that's like 2,000 miles at least or something. And I think you briefly mentioned it before, but young of the year or juvenile great whites, like smaller white sharks, they tend to stay in the shallower waters, don't they? And do we know why?
Yeah, but when I say shallow, I mean shelf waters. So that doesn't necessarily mean, right on your beach. It means that, at least on the eastern seaboard of the U.S., on the continental shelf, which in some areas extends out as far as 100 miles.
So shelf waters refers to a geological classification of the ocean floor. So essentially in the middle of the ocean, you've just got that deep, actually called abyssal plain. And that's just the deep, dark areas of the ocean. And then as you move closer to the continents, that plain starts to rise, which turns into what is actually called the continental rise. And then that slope gets even steeper and it turns into the continental slope. And then that slope flattens out and becomes the continental shelf until it reaches the shore or the beach where we're used to. Not the abyssal plain miles beneath the surface. But what he was saying, shelf waters, just refers to that area that's shallower than the rest of the ocean comparatively, but shallow in comparison to the deep, dark abyssal plain is over 300 feet on average. So it's still really deep compared to what we're used to. It's not like going from 8 feet of water, which is deep, to now 3 feet of water, which is shallow. It's not like that at all, and it's on a much larger scale. So as you can imagine, the width of that continental shelf is much greater than a pool. Because I was curious and I know nothing, I just looked it up. The average width of the U.S. Atlantic continental shelf was almost 85 miles. So you can kind of think of the ocean as a two-floored house. The first floor is the abyssal plain, where it's just low, it's at the bottom, and then you take the stairs up to the second floor, and those stairs are both the continental rise and the continental slope, and then once you get to the second floor, you're at the continental shelf. You're much higher than that abyssal plain. And the water over the continental shelf is the shelf water. So now you're a geologist. So as white sharks grow older, do they move more offshore? Or do they still like to bask in the shallow end like I do?
We know that at least in the western North Atlantic, on the eastern seaboard, you could find everything from juveniles, newborns, right up to adults on the continental shelf, all right? And the shelf is this shallow plateau that extends off the eastern seaboard of the U.S. It's narrowest down off of North Carolina, but it's also extends out pretty far here in New England and off of Florida. But as white sharks get older, and usually, in excess of, say, 9 or 10 feet long, we've noticed that they begin to make these offshore excursions off the continental shelf out into pelagic habitat or the open Atlantic Ocean. And when they're out in the open Atlantic, and they'll go as far east as the Azores, and when they're out there, they'll dive down to depths as great as 2,000, 3,000 feet deep, and we don't have a clue what they're doing. We think they're feeding, they're foraging, but those larger white sharks will make those oceanic excursions.
Holy crap, 3,000 feet? Do you know how they withstand such drastic changes in temperature and pressure? Because those are insane changes.
The pressure's not an issue for them because unlike mammals, unlike us, they don't breathe air, so they don't have air pockets. So pressure, their density is neutral in the water column. And so they don't have to deal with the extremes of air breathing animals have to deal with when it comes to pressure.
Gotcha.
But they do go through an incredibly broad temperature range. And so, for example, they might go from surface water temperatures that can be in the 70s or 80s down into temperatures as low as, the high 30s. So that's a really broad temperature range. And what's interesting about white sharks, as similar to their cousins like the mako or the porbeagle, is they can elevate their body temperature, which is very, very unique in the fish world. So in essence, white sharks are, for lack of a better term, warm-blooded, like mammals
cool.
are, only not exactly the same. So they can elevate their body temperature to be above ambient water temperature, their outside water temperature, by 10, 15, 20 degrees.
Wow.
And that allows them to permeate these colder temperatures.
Oh my gosh, that's so cool. I had no idea. That's amazing. I mean, that's definitely got to help because that's got to be at least like a 20-degree drop from the surface down to 3,000 feet. I just found a study that said there's about a 35-degree difference between the surface water and water at 3,000 feet below the ocean surface. Now, this was in the Gulf of Mexico, so the surface water is probably a lot warmer than it would be off Cape Cod, but still, that's crazy. It was almost 80 degrees at the surface, and then at 3,000 feet, it was nearly 40 degrees Fahrenheit. That is water I do not want to swim in. Thankfully, I probably never will. Whew, thank God.
Yeah, and being able to elevate that allows your body to function normally. All our bodies operate, whether you're a human or a fish, you have a very specific temperature range that we operate under. For us, it's 98.6, and we can hit that. Our bodies are physiologically capable of hitting 98.6. And we know that when our temperature drops below that or well above it, we're not feeling well, right? Mm-hmm. In the case of fish, it's not that strict a limit. They have more of a temperature range at which they operate within, but if they get outside that range, their bodies don't function normally, much like ours doesn't. So, they get outside this range of temperatures and they begin to have serious problems. So fish want to be within very specific temperature ranges. Mm. And that's the reason that most species of fish that come to the northeastern U.S., do so on a seasonal basis. Okay. Because in the wintertime, temperatures drop. And this is true for white sharks as well. They drop below outside that normal operating range. Their bodies simply say, we don't function at those temperatures. So what the animals do is they migrate away from those temperatures back down to southern areas.
Ah, so that's how they manage temperature changes. With the seasons, they just move up and down the coast.
Exactly.
And with such a huge geographic range, how does that affect conservation management of the white shark? I feel like that would make it incredibly difficult, more than it already is.
Yeah, it's a great question because it certainly can. When you talk about animals that move over great distances in time and space, right? We classify those critters under the general term of highly migratory species, right? And the U.S. government and the states manage highly migratory species a little bit differently than we would a species that stays exclusively within our waters. So, for example, a good example might be, the striped bass population. Striped bass migrate along the eastern seaboard of the United States. We manage them at the federal and at the state level, but for the most part, they don't enter the waters of that belong to other countries. They stay within U.S. waters, which makes it a lot easier for us to manage that particular population. Mm-hmm. If we talk about blue sharks, bluefin tuna, white marlin, we talk about white sharks, makos, we talk about these highly migratory species. You're talking about an animal that might traverse the entire Atlantic Ocean. And when it does so, it may enter the waters of multiple countries.
Right.
Okay. So we manage those animals in concert with other countries. So we have various treaties to do that. The dominant treaty in the North Atlantic is called ICCAT, ICCAT. It stands for the International Commission for the Conservation of Atlantic Tunas. And although it references tunas, it includes swordfish, it includes billfish, it includes sharks, as well as all the tuna species. And so basically we sit down at the table with, I think, on the order of 50 plus nations.
Wow.
To discuss how we want to divide up this pie that we call, bluefin tuna or call swordfish or call, blue sharks. And so we conduct stock assessments to determine whether those populations are healthy. We base that on data that are provided by all these nations. And in an ideal world, we'll all agree to get along and manage at sustainable levels. But there tends to be, disagreement among countries. There always is, whether we're talking about, fish or whatever. And so some of these issues become contentious. The big hot topic, for example, right now is shortfin mako. The mako shark population is considered to be overfished severely, and overfishing is still occurring.
Oh boy. Welcome to the world of fisheries management where there's 1,000 terms to know and everybody seems to know them except you. Don't worry, I swear you're not alone. I've been associated with fisheries management for at least 6 months now, and I still struggle with the difference between overfishing and overfished. So here we go. When a fishery is overfished, that just means the sexually mature individuals within the species or population are unable to produce enough baby fishies to replace how many are lost every year to either fishing or just to the fish dying naturally in the wild. On the other hand, when overfishing is occurring, That just means that fishing is happening so intensely that basically too many fish are being taken to the point that it's unsustainable, or at least could be more sustainable. I know that's still probably very confusing, and it seems to me like they still overlap to a certain degree, but they are different. They are. And though they're very similar, overfishing refers to fishing mortality, or the rate of fish killed by the fishermen that catch them. And then an overfished fishery refers to the biomass of the population, or the stock of a fish. And so this is just the amount of fish that are in the water. So they're very similar, but they're calculated in different ways. And maybe they wouldn't get intertwined in my brain so much if they weren't the same word, but I don't know. That's just how things are done. But anyways, that's what Greg's talking about when he talks about overfished and overfishing.
So we need everybody fishing in the Atlantic to throttle back on killing makos. But they're still going to interact with fishing gear. So when we talk about white sharks, we have very high level of protection for white sharks in the U.S. And so does Canada for the most part. But what happens when it leaves U.S. waters? And U.S. waters extend out to about 200 miles. Those animals are exposed to fisheries being conducted by other countries. And those other countries may not have the same level of protection. And for the most part, probably don't. And so they're going to catch a white shark and kill it. So we may protect it, but other countries might kill it. And so that's why a really firm understanding of the movements of these animals in time and space is really important, So those white sharks that wander out on a walkabout into the Atlantic are basically going into an area that exposes them to some level of risk.
That just sounds like such a difficult thing to try to work around. I mean, it's like working on a group project, but then you have billions of people trying to figure out how to best manage this one thing, and then everyone has an opinion. It just seems so complicated. But in the past couple years, it seems like there's been such a big push for legislation against shark finning, both in the EU and the US, which is awesome. And I mean, I hope that continues to go through, because I would bet that would do a lot to help shark populations as well.
Well, no, you have to understand, shark finning is already banned in most places.
Oh.
The recent initiative, so basically, if finning, the practice of finning is actually catching a shark, cutting its fins off, and throwing the rest overboard and keeping just the fins. And that has been illegal in the U.S. for many, many years. So fishermen that fish for sharks in the United States have to keep the entire fish, sell it, and we count it toward a very specific quota.
Oh, naturally attached.
Absolutely. So, and dealers who deal in fins can only buy and sell fins that are harvested from sharks that have not been finned. Okay, so that is already in place in the United States and in other countries. The newest initiative is to actually ban the sale of all fins, period. So let's just not sell fins, because there's concern that there's a bunch of cheating going on, right? And not necessarily by U.S. fishermen, by perhaps the fishermen that we're buying fins from. So in other words, if we're moving fins through the U.S., right, they may be coming from countries that still allow the practice of finning or are not policing it to the extent where they're stopping it.
Okay.
So in other words, if we're moving, there's a whole bunch of countries out there that may be moving fins, that are harvested illegally or harvested from fish that were dumped overboard. And so the latest push is to say, well, in order to stop that, let's just not buy any fins whatsoever. And so I can understand the reasoning for doing that. But I want to make sure that we're not also hurting our own domestic interests,
right.
Because our guys are going out of their way to only harvest sharks, sell the meat, do it at sustainable levels, so very low levels. And I would hate to put them out of business because there's some cheaters out there.
Yeah, that's such a difficult balance to hit.
It is. Yeah, it is.
And yeah, that's a good clarification. I didn't realize the difference between, I guess, wholesale of the shark compared to just finning, and where that stands within the U.S. So what I've learned so far? Don't be afraid to say something stupid in front of the famous person you look up to as a role model. Because turns out, you just might learn something. And I did. Yahoo!
Right. And there are some groups out there that are going out of their way not to tell you that difference, because they see the goal. Their goal is to stop the sale of fins, period. I think it's important that everybody be well educated with the issues and then make your own mind up, and if selling no fins is the only way we're going to get around cheating, then so be it. But I think everybody ought to make the right decision based on, well-informed public.
Oh, absolutely. And we've talked about that on this podcast, is just the best way to be, I guess, just a citizen is to be informed. Regardless of what it's about, just be informed and know your stuff if you can. And going back to behavior, because that's my favorite. I love behavioral ecology. It's just so fascinating to me. But are great white sharks social to any degree?
We know at some point in their lives they have to be social because they got to make baby sharks, right? But a lot of cool studies have been done around the world in places where folks, great scientists have had a chance to really observe white sharks, right? Particularly white sharks when they're around each other, So, for example, the Farallon Islands, where they've been studying white sharks since the 60s and 70s. South Africa, places where they could see white sharks interact with one another. We think there's definitely social interactions between white sharks, and that's going to happen relative to reproductive biology, and it's going to happen relative to competition for resources, right? Mm-hmm. So if you get a tight area where, white sharks are feeding on juvenile elephant seals off California, and a white shark kills an elephant seal, they've observed a bigger white shark come in and basically say, "Thank you, I'll take that." The bully, the bully on the block. We see lots of scars on white sharks, which are obviously from other white sharks. So they're interacting. So they're either competing for food or they're trying to mate. It might be a male trying to mate with a female, so he's biting her. She may react by biting him back saying, "Not now, pal. That's not going to happen." The proverbial slap in the face, right? Yeah. And so there also might be males fighting with other males over an area where they're competing for food resources. So these social interactions are going on. We don't get to see them directly as much as we want, but the new technologies that we're using that have camera tags built into, tagging systems, tag packages, we're slowly revealing some of these really cool interactions. The use of drone technology, for example, being able to observe a white shark from above and what it's doing. We're using more and more of that technology to see how these animals interact with their prey and interact with each other.
Yeah, that really is an amazing technology that I'm glad is getting used more, because when I've seen drone footage of great white sharks feeding on a whale carcass, it's so cool to see multiple around, just like in this feeding frenzy type situation. And as much as we think of them as solitary hunters, which they may still be, it's interesting to think about them as social, even just a little bit. Like, that's so cool to think that a large shark, that a large fish, has some sort of social life.
Yeah, I think they're alone for the most part until they get to these areas where they're forced to overlap. It's kind of like, think of it as a restaurant. A restaurant opens, right? Or even worse yet, a bar.
There's a bar around the corner?
Yeah. That place is a real dump.
Oh, okay.
We'll take it. Any price.
Well, hang on a second. We don't know if we'll take it. We haven't even seen it yet.
Right? A bar opens, right? And you got all these people, coming to this bar. And you'll have little pockets of people that know each other, right? But most people don't know each other, but you're all into this area all together. Well, sometimes there are social interactions, right? And sometimes they're positive and sometimes they're negative. It's just what happens. Yeah. And the same thing happens at an aggregation site like the Farallon Islands or Cape Cod, where you've got all this great food lying on the beach and you're competing for it. And, sometimes you get positive interactions. Maybe a male and a female are together, or sometimes you get negative interactions with, back off, buddy, that's mine, So, the same thing happens throughout the animal world.
And do you know if any of their behaviors are learned or are they just innate, just pre-programmed into their brains? And I guess the one specific behavior I'm thinking of is their breaching behavior, the one that always gets airtime. Oh, didn't even mean the pun, but the one behavior shown on Shark Week where they're breaching. The sharks are leaping out of the water.
So the breaching behavior we see a lot of in South Africa, and that's largely dictated by the behavior of the prey.
Oh.
And so when it comes to predatory strategy, I think it is all learned. And I think it's learned through trial and error. I don't think it's learned the same way we might teach our children, right? Mm-hmm. Mammals tend to learn from each other. I don't think sharks learn from each other. I think that they have to do it through their own personal trial and error. So a white shark might be hardwired to know that a seal is going to taste good because it smells good, right? It's picking up cues in the water column that are telling it, it's like your buddy is having a barbecue, right? Your neighbor, right? And your neighbor fires up the grill, we kind of inherently know that smells good. So even if I blindfolded you, you would probably be able to find that yard.
Oh, definitely.
You may not be able to find the grill itself, but you'd be able to find that yard. And so I think the white sharks are hardwired to at least get into the right area. But then they have to figure out that they're dealing with a critter that does not want to be eaten, right? And so they have to learn through trial and error that the best and most effective way to ambush a seal is through various different kinds of approaches. So going back to breaching behavior, you've got seals that are leaving the seal beach, Seal Island off South Africa. And their primary goal is to run the gauntlet, but to get out as fast as they can to deep water where they can feed. They can't stay on the beach all the time. So they do this at the surface. And so the shark is going to stay down deep and it's going to use its vision to see the seal at the surface, but it knows in order to strike that seal, it's going to learn that it has to do it with speed and great momentum. And so it'll ambush from below with great speed. And it does it with so much speed, in essence, it's pinning the seal against a barrier, and the barrier is the surface. And so it's grabbing that seal, but it's got so much speed that it carries it out of the water. All right? So its goal isn't necessarily to breach. Its goal is to pin that seal against a barrier. And so in the case of white sharks around Cape Cod, the water's not deep enough to pin it against the surface. So what they're doing is they're striking laterally, In essence, they're pinning the seals against the beach.
Oh.
Right? So the beach is a barrier system. So they're pinning the seals against the beach and waiting, just going back and forth, waiting for the seals to come out and then hitting them laterally with speed and stealth. So you don't see the breaching behavior, but it's a strategy they've got to figure out.
Oh, interesting. Just as simple as trial and error.
Yeah. I mean, we went through this, hundreds of thousands of years ago when we had to hunt, right?
Yeah.
And still, we've got great advantages with our weaponry these days, but you talk to any deer hunter or moose hunter, they have to figure out the strategy in order to successfully get their prey. And so animals do this every day. And whether you're, a lion on the Serengeti or a shark off Cape Cod, you've got to learn that behavior. And, you do it through trial and error, or you die, or you move on. You might move on, right? Mm-hmm. You may say to yourself, and I'm sure there are certain sharks that can't figure it out and they end up feeding on, dead whale carcasses, which they try to find, or schooling bass or codfish or any other, maybe even dolphins and porpoises, but, they develop different strategies. And when you study these animals, it's really interesting because no two sharks are identical. Each one might have its own behavior and own strategy, which makes it kind of frustrating because you can't generalize necessarily about the strategic approach of all white sharks, you have to talk about individuals.
Yeah, and that's just what makes it hard, but I mean, that's also what I love, the personalities and their unique characteristics that make them who they are, that make them individuals, and not these robotic clones. But again, I guess that just makes it hard for scientists because then the researchers can't put the animal into its box, into where they want to categorize it.
Well, yeah, exactly. What we try to do as scientists is you're always looking for patterns, right? But you're looking for patterns at the species or the population level. It makes it easier to manage a population if you know what it's doing. It's really easy to do with some species, perhaps like striped bass. We know where they give birth to their young. We know where they hatch. We know where they move every season, and they move as a school. And it makes it a little easier to manage that population from a natural resource perspective. When you got white sharks all doing different behaviors, it's harder to generalize and it's harder to predict. If you don't have a pattern, you can't forecast, right? And so that makes it harder for scientists, but at the same time, more challenging and I think more adventurous.
Obviously, this episode ran long because I'm splitting it up into 2 parts, but I just didn't expect it to run this long. And right around here, we were just passing the hour mark that I told him we'd try to stick to. But even through his lunch break, he was just like, yeah, let's just keep doing this. Keep lobbing questions at me. I can do this for days. I'm just paraphrasing here, but that's basically what he said. But so one of my favorite things about science is the adventuring. The getting to go out in the field and do just different science experiments or different sampling or something. Whatever it is, it just gets you out and you're not like stuck at an office. You're not stuck at a desk. But especially with something that I've always wanted to do, like look for great white sharks, or just sharks in general, I asked Greg what a typical day in the field looking for great white sharks is like. So here he is.
Sure, and I'll probably use the white shark as an example because we do tend to have a typical field day for white sharks. Just taking a step back and looking at the broader job description and perhaps something that I find very attractive about the job that you probably do too, Sam. But when you're working over the course of a year on multiple projects through multiple seasons, you tend to have a job that changes all the time. And for me, that's really exciting,
Yeah, me too.
I'm not the kind of person that can do the same thing every day, 52 weeks a year. And so we may be working on hammerheads in April, but going down and to St. Croix in the Virgin Islands and working on tiger sharks in June, And so July, August, September, October are white sharks. And so the typical day for us with white sharks would be, getting up, loading gear into a vehicle and driving down to Cape Cod, Outer Cape in particular. We leave from Chatham. We all meet at the dock sometime between 8 and 8:15. 8:30. We load gear onto the boat. I set up the tagging pole. We set up the tags. All the tags have to be rigged beforehand. Because we have to work in bright sunlight, our plane goes up at about 9 a.m. We leave the dock about 8:30, quarter to 9, head out to our study area, which is anywhere along the eastern side of Cape Cod. We put the plane up. The plane is looking for white sharks. He spots a shark. As soon as the plane sees a shark, he tells us. We then go to that location. We have a GoPro mounted on a long pole. I'll take video of that shark. We'll listen to see if that shark is already tagged. We'll get visuals of that shark. We'll get a size estimate. We'll get video. If the shark continues to behave, meaning it's staying relatively close to the surface, so somewhere between a meter of the surface, we'll then try to tag that shark. And so we could spend 5 minutes or 15 minutes or a half hour with that single shark.
Oh, cool.
If it's tagged, we will then, leave it at be and move on to the next shark. And this will happen up to anywhere between 3 and 4 o'clock in the afternoon. The light starts to get low. The plane can't see as well. We may travel from the southern tip of Cape Cod, of the Outer Cape, which is Monomoy Island, way down near the elbow, all the way up to Provincetown over the course of a day, which is about 40 to 45 miles.
That's a long way.
So seeing, videotaping, and tagging as many sharks as we can. get back to the dock, unload the boat into the cars, and drive back to our homes. And so that would be your typical field day on Cape Cod. But over the course of the day, you'll see lots of different parts of Cape Cod. You may see a white shark kill a seal. You'll videotape that. You'll see seals on the beach. You'll record where they are and what they're doing. You may see sharks that you've seen before, and depending on the technologies that we're using that particular day, we'll use different kinds of tags on those sharks. So we'll observe shark behavior. So there's a lot going on throughout the day, and none of it is boring.
Oh, that's so awesome. I mean, I bet that's just one constant adrenaline rush.
It really is. It really is.
For me, it's one thing just being out on the water. I love that, and I would do that any day of the week, regardless. But then you get to see sharks, much less great white sharks. Like, for real. That's pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, I gotta pinch myself, I gotta pinch. It's too darn fun. I shouldn't be having this much fun. It's a job. They're actually paying me to do this, Now, granted, I don't get rich, but, it's a job. I'll take it.
Yeah, hey, you do what you love, and you just don't care about how many zeros are in your account.
Yeah, and on some, you've seen us on Shark Week, obviously. And, and there are scientists that disagree with us doing Shark Week, and I get criticized by various people. Some of them are jealous. Some of them are just simply, cynical. And, but I happen to believe that, and it goes back to what we talked about earlier, Sam, it's one thing to do the science, another thing to share it with the public. And what better way to share it than through, probably the greatest, television vector there is when it comes to sharks. And that's Shark Week, and we do stuff with Shark Fest and National Geographic too. And I feel the same way, Yeah, some of the shows may be goofy. Some of them are a little bit hokey. Some of them don't have a lot of science, but I work with production companies that produce science. And if I can get one little kid watching Shark Week excited about sharks because he saw us do something cool and he learned a little bit of a tidbit about shark science, then I think we've achieved our goal, and I'm willing to keep doing that, And so, there may be days when we're working with a film crew on the water, and that film crew is not only supporting the research by buying tags, but also paying for the plane, paying for the boat, and we're leveraging it to produce television.
Well, Greg, I can assure you that kid is me. I am that kid that you have inspired, and honestly are still inspiring.
That's excellent. I'm really happy to hear that. That's awesome. That's awesome. That means a lot to me, and if I can meet a Sam McNeely every day, I'd be a happy guy, And I am a happy guy because kids reach out to me all the time.
That's got to be such a joy to hear how you've made an impact on people, and especially through kids. Like, they're so fun to talk to. But through Shark Week and just different talks, it's got to be so encouraging to hear from other people about how you're inspiring them.
Yeah, it really is. And, to me, it's about the sharks. If I can highlight the sharks and get people to embrace them, then we're going in the right direction.
Wow. Couldn't have said it better. I think I'm going to steal that for the mission statement of this podcast. And that actually leads perfectly into my next question, which can be a little tough. But I know how easy it is to get down in the dumps just with the world on fire around us, especially now and in the past few years. But what's the bright spot for you? What gets you out of bed, gets you going? Other than coffee, what wakes you up in the morning?
Well, I think we're going in the right. Many countries are going in the right direction. It took the U.S. a long time, but we have a management system in place that has led to the restoration of many populations of sea animals, including sharks and seals and whales and dolphins and a number of other fish species. Mm-hmm. We've got laws in place that mandate us to reach certain milestones related to conservation. And we're sharing that. So I honestly believe the U.S. is a great example of how you can keep fishermen, for the most part, in business and balance sustainable harvest with conservation. And we're sharing that with the world, and other countries. Australia's been doing it as well for decades. They've done New Zealand, they've done a great job. parts of Europe is lagged behind. They talk the talk, but haven't walked the walk for many years, and they're doing it now. They're beginning to do it.
Good.
But they have fisheries that have been in existence for thousands of years. And so it's very, fish is very much more cultural to a lot of European nations. And so it's really hard for them to change. And they have, though. They are going in the right direction. And now we're working with developing countries, which is the next step, because they see fish as much needed protein, and we don't want them to starve to death. And we have to make an impact on other developed nations, with regard to the fin trade, for example. But I honestly am optimistic because we're going in the right direction. We have younger people coming up, like yourself, who have the right perspective and know what we need to do and are willing to do it, and old codgers like me are being replaced by young, new, talented people as well, and so with innovative minds and great new modeling and technological advancements. So I'm very positive about the future. I am.
And I love that. And we need more positivity. And like from you, it's contagious. So it just reflects on me.
I hope so. I hope so. There are big hurdles to, climb.
Mm-hmm.
There are mountains to climb, basically, but we'll get there. We'll do it. We will do it. We're a smart species. We screw up a lot, but we're smart.
Yeah.
I don't think it's too late. Let's put it that way.
And like you said, we learn from our mistakes. No better time than now.
Exactly. We've made quite a few.
And I don't even know how you're going to answer this question because you've accomplished more than, I could ever dream of accomplishing in the world of marine science. But do you have any future goals, any other things that you're trying to really achieve within the world of marine science and with white sharks?
Oh, you know what? There's always a new goal. I always like to set the bar high and hope I'll get there someday. But, as you just said, I never thought we'd achieve as much as we have. And, I know there's a lot of I and Greg, but the truth is I have an amazing team of people and collaborators and students that I work with or have worked with or have inspired me. And, it's all part of that team. And for me, as I look forward, it's inspiring young people to replace me, and so I've got great young scientists that I work with now that I think are a hell of a lot smarter than me. and there's still a lot of new technologies that are coming out. And I'm all about new gadgets. I love them. I love new gadgets. And I like to go to places where people haven't gone before. And so I'm going to keep doing that for the next 10 years, hopefully, maybe longer. And with the help of the others I work with and just keep, breaking the ceiling and pushing the envelope and trying to think outside the box and work with people who are really good at it.
Yeah, no, mooch off others as much as you can. You've got a great team behind you, it sounds like. I mean, y'all have just been able to accomplish so much. It's incredible.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's mostly them, but it's good. It's great. I think of myself as more lucky than good, but, luck is a good thing to have.
Yeah, you've got to have some level of luck on your side, don't you?
Yeah.
And now I've got a few fun questions for you. And initially, before today, when I was prepping, I was thinking, oh, his answer is going to be obvious to this question. But now, after hearing about all the different species that you've worked with, do you have a favorite animal?
Oh, it used to depend on what I was working with at the time. If I was tagging a hammerhead and you said to me, what's your favorite shark? I'd say hammerheads. When I went through the basking shark stuff, I still love basking sharks. They're so
They're
much
gorgeous.
we need to learn about them still. And I like Greenland sharks. I haven't worked on Greenland sharks in over 20 years.
Wow.
But my experience with Greenland sharks was the most dangerous I've ever had and most exciting, invigorating, diving under 6 feet of Arctic ice.
Oh, God.
In, 29 degree water with a Greenland shark scared the living hell out of me, but it was incredible work. But I have to say with what we're learning, a lot of my newest friends are white sharks, right? I see them from year to year, and I've become close with them. And so the white shark has really emerged as my favorite species right now, particularly in reference to, this separate personality kind of traits that they have that I find really amazing and something I'd never embrace in a fish through all my schooling. You don't think of them as having these individual traits that would give them almost a sense of individuality and personality. And so
Right.
I would say right now that the white shark still stands out above the rest as my favorite species, because there's still so much. I tend to favor those that I know so little about,
Mm-hmm.
and as much as I think we've learned, we got a long way to go with them.
That's got to be so cool to see the same shark a year later. Like, hey,
Yeah.
I know you. What's going on? Where you been?
I know. There's not many species of animals you can do that with, particularly fish. The average fisherman catches a striped bass that's, sub-legal size. He doesn't say to it when he releases it, "See you next year." He might say it, but he knows very well he's never going to see that fish again.
Yeah.
I can definitively say, I'll see you again. I'll see you again soon, unless,
That's amazing.
something unfortunate happens to it. Or me.
Yeah, just meeting back up with old friends.
Yeah, old friends.
Okay, now a similar question, but more difficult. If you could be any animal that best describes your personality, what would it be and why?
Oh, man. Any animal, terrestrial or otherwise?
Yeah, any animal, you name it.
God, if you asked my kids, it would probably be a freaking tiger. Bulldog, I don't know. The pit bull, sometimes, but a mouse other times. It's hard to say. I grew up, infatuated with fish, so obviously I'm going to choose a fish.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd like to think of myself as a top predator, but I'm not a very big person. Maybe a bull shark. Bull sharks don't get as big as tigers, but they can be tough. They don't get as big as white sharks, but they can be tough.
They're feisty.
Nice and feisty and a bit unpredictable. Maybe too unpredictable. And I certainly don't bite people. I wouldn't want to hurt anybody. So maybe more graceful animal like a blue shark. That's a tough question, Sam. I'm just going to keep throwing species out there and never really settle on one, but definitely a shark.
We'll just mash them together. We'll make you a great blue mako shark or something.
Yeah, if we can mash up all those different personalities of these various sharks. Like, I'd love to be a mako because they're fast and they're sleek and they're dominant, but I don't think of myself as being that dominant. So maybe the blue shark is a little bit more of a passive animal that can still be a top predator, and really a graceful animal in the water. Just incredible creatures. And really the first shark I ever worked on seriously,
I was going to say, it all ties back to your roots. It was meant to be.
Yeah. But, the end of the day, I might just be like the guppies in that tank behind me, just a guppy.
Just a freaking guppy.
Just a guppy in a big world.
It all depends on the day for me. Whether I'm a guppy or whether I'm a great white.
Yeah, exactly.
So that was the remarkable and renowned great white researcher, Dr. Greg Skomal. And we actually chatted for a few minutes after this podcast, and he had a few really key things to say, which I'm going to play here for you.
One of the things I like to emphasize the beauty of these animals, and I do that. But at the same time, I don't want to bury my head in the sand with the simple fact that every now and then one of these animals screws up and hurts somebody. And so that's a real big focus of our research right now, trying to figure out how and why and when and where that happens, and figure out how we can prevent it.
Like I said last week, Greg isn't super into social media, but his organization, the Atlantic White Shark Conservancy, is. The Atlantic White Shark Conservancy supports scientific research, improves public safety, and educates the community to inspire white shark conservation. So, in a word, baller. They can be found online at atlanticwhiteshark.org, on Facebook and YouTube at Atlantic White Shark Conservancy, and on Instagram and Twitter at @A_white_shark. And these platforms follow a lot of white shark research, which of course means they follow Greg too. So go give him a follow. I sure do, and it's fantastic. Sorry, it's fantastic. You can support this podcast by becoming a real Elasmite donor at patreon.com/elasmospod. Not a fake donor, a real donor. Your donation is literally what keeps me going, and it really means so much to me. It truly does. And I appreciate every single donation, no matter the amount. Please also rate and review this podcast so other shark lovers will hear about it and might get the chance to be on this show. And of course, send that rating and review to me at elasmospod@gmail.com to be entered into a raffle, and share this podcast on social media, tagging us to get 2 extra entries into the drawing. You can find us on Instagram and Twitter at elasmospod, and on Facebook and YouTube at the Elasmos Podcast, A Shark's Universe. And don't forget to email your marine adventure stories to me at elasmospod@gmail.com so that your story can be told on our listeners' episode. Our website is elasmospod.com, where you can find links to everything, and it was designed and built by Paul McNeely. The theme music was created and performed by Connor Blake and Wes McNeely. Wes can be found on Instagram at wes.mcneely1 and on YouTube at Wes McNeely. I, on the other hand, can be found at smcneely4335, and now that you've listened through the credits, here's my weekly update. Yesterday, I went grocery shopping, and do you ever see foods that are like, I guess, nostalgic to a certain point? Normally, I'm pretty good about impulse buying because otherwise, I would buy all the Hostess mini donuts I could. Like, literally, I love those things. But I was just walking along with my short list, and I saw animal crackers. Suddenly, I blinked and they were in my cart, and I just thought about playing with them as a kid, like imagining the countertop was the Serengeti, and I was on a safari. And then also my girlfriend Catherine and I made funfetti dip and had animal crackers as the dippers for a date night one time. And that was just a really special impulse date night. And now it's become a regular date night thing. We also just love cooking. It's a great pastime and how we stay happy. And honestly, probably our secret to success. The funfetti dip is also so freaking good, and it's easy to make too. But anyways, animal crackers brought back some good memes, and I love hearing about different foods that people love to make or buy that just bring back some kind of memory, that have some sort of nostalgia to it. It's really fun to hear those kind of stories. So feel free to share those with me. I'd love to read it. Also, they should really make an under the sea version of animal crackers, like a shark. Oh, Elasmo crackers. TM. Anyone want to help me launch this on Kickstarter? We'll figure it out in post. Okay, thanks for listening, everyone. Have a great week, and join me next week for another episode of the Elasmos Podcast. Later, skaters.